So today, we're going to tackle a number you've probably heard a ton about, one that's been a huge deal in retirement planning for years, the 4% rule. It sounds simple, right? But there's actually a lot of debate around it. So let's break down what it is, where it came from, and maybe most importantly, whether it still makes sense today.
Okay, so this is it. This is the big question, right? You've spent decades working hard, saving, and investing to build up this nest egg. And now the really tricky part begins. How in the world do you make that money last for the rest of your life?
And hey, if this is something that keeps you up at night, you are so not alone. A recent survey from BlackRock found that almost 2/3 of savers have this exact same fear, the fear of outliving their money. It is a huge source of stress for a lot of people.
And that's the real trick, isn't it? When you clock out for the last time, those regular paychecks, they stop. The whole challenge becomes creating your own paycheck from your savings, something you can count on month after month to cover everything you need.
So for decades, there was this simple, almost elegant answer to this super complicated problem. And this is where the famous 4% rule comes onto the scene. It was created to give people a clear, straightforward starting point for one of the biggest financial puzzles they'll ever face.
So what's the deal with it? How does it actually work? Well, it's basically a two-part plan. First, in your very first year of retirement, you take out 4% of whatever your portfolio is worth. Simple enough. But the second part is absolutely key. For every year after that, you take out the same dollar amount as the year before, you just give it a little bump for inflation. You're not recalculating the 4% every year. Let's make this real with a quick example. It's actually pretty simple when you see it in action. Let's say you retire with a cool $1 million. In year one, you pull out 4%, which is $40,000. Now let's say inflation for that year was 3%. In year two, you don't take 4% of your new balance. Instead, you take last year's $40,000, add 3% to it, and withdraw $41,200. And you just keep repeating that inflation adjustment process year after year.
Now, it's super important to know where this came from. The whole point of the original research was to find a safe withdrawal rate. The goal was to find a number that, based on historical market performance, would have a really high chance of lasting for a 30-year retirement. So right away, you see a key assumption built in, a 30-year timeline.
But here's where real life kind of throws a wrench in the works. A static rule like this basically assumes your spending is going to be this nice, neat, straight line that just goes up with inflation. But in reality, our spending in retirement looks a lot different. Researchers actually have a cool name for it, the spending smile.
You can kind of think of retirement spending in 3 stages. First, you have the go-go years. You're newly retired, you're active, you're traveling, and spending is high. Then come the slow-go years, where you naturally slow down a bit and your spending tends to drop. But then, in the later years, costs often creep back up, usually driven by healthcare. So you get this U-shaped curve, which is way different than the straight line the 4% rule assumes.
And it's not just our spending habits that are a little unpredictable. There are other, more modern challenges and risks that the original rule just couldn't have fully planned for. And these really add some new wrinkles to the whole retirement puzzle.
Okay, one of the absolute biggest hurdles is something called sequence of returns risk. It sounds complicated, but the idea is simple. Think of it like this. Retiring into a bad market is like starting a long hike in a thunderstorm. A big storm later in the hike might not be a big deal, but one right at the beginning can wash out the whole trail. Bad returns in your first few years of retirement can do way more damage than bad returns later on.
And then, of course, there's the really great news that's also a financial challenge. We're living longer, which is awesome, right? But it means retirements that last 35, even 40 years are not that unusual anymore. And that extra decade puts a whole lot more strain on a portfolio than the original 30-year model was built for.
So because of all this, the weird spending smile, market risks, longer lives, the thinking has really had to evolve. The conversation today has shifted away from finding one single magic number and toward building a more flexible, dynamic strategy that can actually roll with the punches.
And you could really see the shift in thinking right here. On one side, you have that old school static rule. It's rigid, you take out your money no matter what the market's doing. But on the other side, you have a dynamic strategy, which is all about being flexible. It means you can actually adjust what you're doing based on how your investments are performing.
One of the most popular ways to do this is with what they call spending guardrails. And the name is perfect, because that's exactly what they are. You basically set a ceiling and a floor for your spending. If the market has a great year and your portfolio grows, you might get a green light to spend a little more. But if the market has a tough year, the guardrail tells you it might be wise to pull back a bit. It's a system for making smart adjustments.
So, after all this, what's the verdict? Is the 4% rule totally useless now?
No, not at all, not by a long shot. The best way to think about it is as a really helpful starting point. It's an excellent way to get the conversation going and to get a ballpark idea of what might be possible. But it's just not a one-size-fits-all final answer.
And that, right there, is really the main thing to take away from all this. The goal isn't to just find one perfect number and then follow it blindly off a cliff. The real goal is to build a strategy, one that's flexible enough for your life, that can adapt when things change, and that ultimately gives you the confidence to actually go out and enjoy the retirement you worked so hard to build.